Hello and welcome to another A-Level Russia and Revolution History Revision A-Level session. Today we'll be considering what was the main reason the Bolsheviks were able to consolidate their power 1918 to 1924. Remember, the harder you work, the luckier you're going to feel in your exam. Okay, so let's have a look then. How did the Bolsheviks consolidate their power 1918 to 24? Well, there's key areas and reasons why they were able to do it. The government, military, economic reforms, social reforms, and repression. And we're considering not only how did they do this, but what was the main reason they were able to consolidate their power. Okay, so let's start by having a look at the government then. So one reason that the Bolsheviks were able to consolidate their power in 1918 to 24 was the way that they dealt with the Constituent Assembly. Initially, when the Bolsheviks seized power, they did not have the majority of support across the country. And that was shown in the November 1917 elections, which went ahead for the Constituent Assembly, which had originally was going to replace the provisional government. The Social Revolutionaries got 40% of the votes, whereas the Bolsheviks only got 24% of the votes, which is considerably less. And the Bolsheviks didn't want dual authority, so in order to consolidate their power and prevent there being dual authority and conflict like there had been with the provisional government, what they did was they used the Red Guards to close and disband the Constituent Assembly when it refused to be subservient to the Bolsheviks. They also set up a decree for the Sovnarkom. The Sovnarkom was going to be the new form of government, which the Constituent Assembly refused to be subservient to. And it was the Council for the People's Commissars, it was called, and Lenin was the chairman. It was designed to be basically the new government of Russia, and Lenin, being the chairman of this Council of Commissars, basically was the prime minister, if you like. It wasn't ideal, it lacked experience, and the state bank even actually refused the Sovnarkom funds, so it proves it's not the main reason that the Bolsheviks were able to consolidate their power. However, it was important because by closing the Constituent Assembly and establishing the Sovnarkom and making Lenin basically the sole ruler and decision maker for the country of Russia, this did help them increase their power and control over Russia. Additionally, something else in the government that helped the Bolsheviks consolidate their power was actually that the opposition to the Bolsheviks seizing control and closing the Constituent Assembly was actually divided. So, for example, the left social revolutionaries actually supported the Bolsheviks' ideas, so they weren't too worried that they'd taken control, whereas the moderate social revolutionaries wanted to practice peaceful demonstrations against what had happened. The Mensheviks were divided until about May 1918, so they didn't take any effective action against the Bolsheviks' closure of the Constituent Assembly either. So in some ways you could argue that it's division of opponents which makes it possible for the Bolsheviks to consolidate their power in government. They do also introduce, though, as well as the Sovnarkom, the idea of a new name for Russia, which had previously been known as the RSFSR, and has Russia in its name. Now it was going to be known as the USSR, which was therefore about a Soviet republic, the United States of the Soviet Republic. So it is not about Russia itself, it's not a geographical term, so it's a state without boundaries, it includes minorities, it doesn't exclude anyone. So in some small way that also helped to unify people under the Bolsheviks, who became known as the communists. Okay, well, that's not the only reason the Bolsheviks were able to consolidate their power in 1918 to 1924. So let's have a look at their military victories and consider whether they were maybe more or less important than the reforms to government in enabling the Bolsheviks to consolidate their power. Well, there's two kind of key military events which we need to discuss. There's the end of World War I and there's victory in the Civil War, and how those both managed to help the Bolsheviks to gain power. So the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed in March 1917, and it was the ending of Russia's involvement in World War I, not the ending of World War I itself. Be careful that you clarify that in your answers. It meant that Russia had to agree to losing a third of their population and half of their industry. So it was actually quite a humiliating treaty. However, it was key to making sure that they maintained support from particularly the peasants and the industrial workers, who they'd had peace, land, bread as their propaganda slogan for, peace being the key part here. Potentially also bread, because there's a lack of that whilst they were still at war. So by signing this treaty and ending the war, it meant that there was peace, it meant that there was more stability in the economy, it meant that people could return to work, and then agriculture would potentially recover. So this was important in enabling the Bolsheviks to gain support, although it was also quite humiliating. Secondly, victory in the Civil War. This was incredibly important in enabling the Bolsheviks to consolidate their power. As 1918 to 21, they faced the potential threat of, through civil war, overthrow by the white forces, who wanted the return basically to a czarist system. And they were supported by foreign troops, the Allies, who wanted to overthrow the Bolsheviks, placing the whites back in place in the hope that maybe this would mean that Russia would return to fighting in World War One, so that Germany would be fighting a war on two fronts. But somehow the Reds were able to be victorious, and by having death sentences for desertion, Trotsky was compromising a bit by using ex-Tsarist officers to train the troops, which meant that they were better trained and more able in the war than they would otherwise have been. There was a lot of communication between their troops, and because of their geographical placement, it was easier for them to communicate with each other and to use the train lines and communication lines in order to move their troops around in a more effective way than the white troops. And ultimately, this is an incredibly important way that the Bolsheviks were able to consolidate their power, as by having victory in the Civil War, defeating the whites and the Allies, it meant that they prevented them from replacing their leadership, because if the whites had been successful in the war, and the Allies had continued to support them through to 1921, then potentially the Bolsheviks would have completely lost their power over the country, because their aim was to replace the Bolsheviks with either a Tsarist form of autocracy again, or with another form of rulership. So ultimately, this is probably one of the most important reasons that the Bolsheviks were able to consolidate their power: victory in the Civil War. Much more important than just the change of government, because ultimately, even if they had had a dual authority, they probably wouldn't have been completely out of power. If they hadn't won the Civil War, they wouldn't be in power. But that's not the only reason that they were able to keep their power. Again, another reason that's quite important actually is repression. The use of repressive policies. So, for example, the banning of other parties in 1921 enabled the Bolsheviks to be the only party, and they also, as part of the 10th Party Congress being basically a meeting of all the Soviets, the representatives from the different groups and countries and states, if you like, of the USSR, the 10th Party Congress also agreed to ban any factions within the Communist Party, so there was only one Communist Party, no one was allowed to disagree with Lenin. By doing this, they consolidated their power, because it meant that that Lenin basically had total control over politics, and no one was allowed to question him. They used the Pravda newspaper as a propaganda tool to spread ideas and propaganda, getting people to support the Bolshevik cause and to feel patriotic about it, and they censored any newspapers which talked against them. So, for example, they arrested the leaders of and closed newspapers for the cadets, the social revolutionaries, and the Mensheviks. So by around 1918, it was a one-party state. This was not the only way they used repression. They also had the GPU and the Cheka. The Cheka was set up in December 1917, and they were used in many different ways, actually, partly to put down uprisings. So, for example, the Cheka were absolutely essential for putting down the Kronstadt rising or rebellion of the sailors and workers in 1921, who were rebelling against the new economic conditions which were being enforced on them. The Cheka hunted down and executed rebels who'd tried to escape. So they made sure that everyone was caught. and the Red Troops were involved as well. So they used the Red Troops, 60,000 of the Red Troops, to put down that rebellion. The Cheka were also used to kill the ex-Tsar and his family in July 1917, and that was important in enabling them to consolidate their power, as it meant that they removed the focus for opposition. So the whites, when they were fighting during the Civil War, wouldn't have such a focus when they were looking to reinstate a Tsar. There wouldn't be one. The GPU started after an assassination attempt on Lenin in 1918, and again they were looking for any potential opposition or opposition to Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and capturing them, killing them, or sending them to camps. And this was an important way that they managed to consolidate their power, as it meant that any potential opposition was effectively wiped out, and anyone who might have considered opposing the Bolsheviks or Lenin would have seen that it wouldn't be very easy for them to do that, or they might have been put off doing that because the Red Troops or the Cheka or the GPU might come after them and kill them. And there wasn't an easy way for people to express any dislike of what was going on with the party, because they'd legally banned the other parties, so they'd censored the papers and things, so the spread of propaganda against the Bolsheviks was difficult. So it meant that people were more likely to stay loyal to the Bolsheviks. And probably a less significant way that the Bolsheviks managed to keep control or consolidate their power was social reforms. It's not as important as repression, but it definitely had an impact. So they passed a decree on land immediately after they had seized control in 1917. And it was designed to confiscate private land and then reallocate it to peasants. So the Bolsheviks compromised on this a little bit, because rather than having it as government-controlled land, which would have been their ideal, because they didn't really believe ideologically that people should own things, it was all supposed to be state-owned, they believed that it was necessary to give the peasants land, because that's what they had really yearned for, and they thought this would prevent there being further rebellions. It was to stop illegal seizure of land and attacks on property, which have been so common and frequent in the provisional government's rule. So not as significant as repressive policies, the use of a GPU and the Cheka and the Red Troops to suppress rebellions, but in some small way it did mean that it was less likely that there would have been rebellion from the peasants. So it meant that the society was more stable. If the peasants were better off, then they'd be much less likely to support rebellion, and since they were a large proportion of society, that was important. Finally, it's important to have a look at the economy and economic reforms that were made during the period 1918 to 1924, and to consider how they also helped the Bolsheviks to consolidate their power. So there was failed war communism and the NEP, and both of these were designed in some small way to help the Bolsheviks to consolidate their power. Obviously, in hindsight, there was failed war communism. They didn't know that at the time. The aim of war communism had been partly ideological, but also to help the Bolsheviks to win the war. It consisted of grain requisitioning, so taking any surplus grain from the peasants, or what was considered to be surplus, in order to make sure that the rest of the country would be fed enough. They weren't given anything for this requisitioned grain, it was just taken from them. And the aim was to make sure that people didn't starve during the Civil War, and to make sure that the army had enough to eat. And it was all supposed to be done on good spirit, that you were supporting your fellow comrades. They also got rid of money. They thought that this would, well, it was part of their ideological view that there shouldn't be money, that people should barter for things and swap things instead. Unfortunately, this was not a particularly successful way of consolidating their power, because grain requisitioning meant that peasants lacked an incentive for growing any extra grain other than what they actually required themselves, which led to subsistence agriculture. Subsistence agriculture is where people just grow enough for themselves and nothing more. So then the production of things like coal, iron, steel, and even food at this point, because it's agricultural things, decreased, and it led to famine in 1921. Black market trade, There was a peasant uprising in Tambov in 1920 to 1921, and indeed there was a really serious uprising, the Kronstadt uprising in 1921, of thousands of sailors and workers over concerns over living conditions. So this was a major problem that they faced, and they overcame this problem by compromising again. They set up a new economic policy after the Kronstadt Rising in 1921. They saw it was just incredibly important that they took action, and so they did things like they reintroduced the free market, the idea that you could buy and sell things for money, and make a profit and that sort of thing. This went against Bolshevik ideals, so it didn't win them any support from Bolsheviks and Marxists and communists. However, it did win the wider support of the population in some ways, as it returned the possibility for peasants to gain something from creating surplus grain. It did indeed also end grain requisitioning, so instead they replaced it with a tax in kind, so peasants gave 10% of what they created, which seemed more fair to them. It led to improved harvests, so 23% more was created in 1923 than it had been in 1920, a year before the Kronstadt Rising, and factory output also increased about 200%, 1920 to 1923. And so in some ways, the NEP, the compromise, managed to overcome the problems they had been facing with the war communism policies and the kind of the costs of the civil war, but only to a certain extent. And I would argue that actually economic reforms were not the main reason why the Bolsheviks were able to consolidate their power, as it also led to what's known as the scissors crisis. So although there was an increase in food being produced and it led to actually a surplus, so more was being created than was actually needed, that led to the decrease in the price of food, whilst the prices of kind of goods that people could buy, not food goods but other goods, consumables, stayed high, which meant that peasants were getting less for money for what they were creating and not being able to afford as much by creating all this. So it didn't entirely overcome the problems of living standards and conditions. So it only sort of maintained, prevented there being outright revolution like the Kronstadt Rising. It didn't really gain them any huge favour with the rest of the population. So considering the factors that we've looked at, so we've got the closure of the Constituent Assembly and setting up of the Sovnarkom, USSR, military victory in particular in civil war and the ending of World War One, economic compromise, if you like, and the setting up of the NEP, replacing war communism, social change and repression. Which of these do you think is the most important reason why the Bolsheviks were able to consolidate their power in 1918 to 24? Justify your answer. Try and write yourself a conclusion for this essay. Make sure you think about the relative importance of the factors. This is the most important reason because although X, Y, and Z did this, that, and the other to help the Bolsheviks, ultimately they were limited because, whereas the most important reason is because... Good luck with your revision.